The scent of smoke still clung to Nora Patterson's hair as she curled into herself on the cold ground, her eyes reflecting the dying embers of what had once been her home. 3 days had passed since the raiders came, 3 days since she'd watched flames devour everything she'd ever known, and still she couldn't bring herself to leave. Wyoming Territory, 1876. The promise of a new beginning had brought Nora and her father west after her mother's passing 2 years prior. At 22, she had embraced the challenge of frontier life, learning to cook on an open hearth, to tend their small garden, to make do with less than she'd had in their comfortable Philadelphia home. Her father had thrived here too, establishing a modest cattle operation that was just beginning to turn a profit, until the night the raiders came. Nora pulled her father's coat tighter around her shoulders as the night air grew colder. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, but hunger seemed a distant concern compared to the hollowness in her chest. The raiders had taken everything: the cattle, their wagon, their supplies, even her father. The memory of the gunshot that took him made her flinch every time it echoed in her mind. "Should have run," she whispered to herself, her voice rough from disuse and grief. "Should have listened to Pa when he told me to hide," but she hadn't run. She'd stood frozen at the window, watching as 5 men circled her father, demanding he tell them where he kept his money. When he'd refused, the leader had shot him without hesitation. The sound had finally broken her paralysis, sending her scrambling out the back door just as they set fire to the cabin. She'd hidden in the tall grass beyond the creek until they'd gone, taking their ill-gotten bounty with them. When she'd returned, the cabin was already consumed by flames, her father's body lost to the inferno. Now she had nothing. No food, no shelter, no family. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and she had no horse to carry her there. So she stayed, curled beside the ashes, too numb to decide what to do next. The sound of approaching hoofbeats jolted her from her stupor. Terror surged through her veins as she scrambled to her feet, eyes darting frantically for somewhere to hide. But the blackened remains of the cabin offered no shelter, and the approaching rider had surely already spotted her. Heart-pounding, Nora snatched up a charred piece of timber, the only weapon within reach, and held it before her with trembling hands as a tall figure on horseback emerged from the growing darkness. "Stay back," she called, her voice breaking. "I have nothing left to steal." The rider slowed his horse, a sturdy palomino that snorted softly in the evening air. He was silhouetted against the setting sun, his broad-shouldered frame topped by a wide-brimmed hat. "I'm not here to harm you, madam," came a deep voice, gentle despite its roughness. The man dismounted with fluid grace that belied his size, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "I saw the smoke from your place days ago, came to see if anyone needed help." Nora didn't lower her makeshift weapon. "You're a bit late for that." The man stepped forward, and in the fading light she could finally see his face. Weathered by sun and wind, it was a face that had seen its share of hardship, but his eyes, a startling blue, held nothing but concern. He couldn't have been more than 30, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and several days' worth of stubble on his jaw. "Name's Hayes Vaughn," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "I run cattle about 5 miles west of here." His gaze moved from her face to the burned cabin behind her, then back again. "Been out tracking strays for 3 days, or I'd have come sooner. What happened here?" Nora's arms began to tremble from holding the heavy piece of wood. "Raiders," she said simply, not trusting her voice with more. Hayes nodded, a muscle in his jaw tightening. "Too many of those vermin in these parts lately." He glanced around, noting the emptiness of the property. "You alone out here, Miss Patterson?" "Nora Patterson." She finally lowered her impromptu weapon, exhaustion winning out over caution. "And yes, my father's dead. They shot him before they burned our home." Hayes removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "I'm mighty sorry to hear that, Miss Patterson." The genuine regret in his voice made her throat tighten. "When's the last time you ate?" The unexpected question made her blink. I don't remember." Without another word, Hayes returned to his horse and reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle and approached her slowly, as one might a spooked colt. "It's not much, just some bread and jerky I packed for my ride, but it's yours if you want it." The smell of the bread, when he unwrapped it, made Nora's stomach clench painfully. Pride warred briefly with necessity before she reached out and took the offered food. "Thank you," she murmured, tearing off a small piece of bread and forcing herself to eat slowly despite her ravenous hunger. Hayes busied himself gathering wood for a fire, giving her privacy as she ate. Soon, a small flame flickered to life, pushing back the darkness that had been closing in around them. "You can't stay here," he said finally, settling on the ground across the fire from her. "These men might come back, and even if they don't, you've got no shelter." Nora stared into the flames, feeling the weight of his words. "I have nowhere else to go. We sold everything to come west. There's no home to return to back east." Hayes was quiet for a long moment. "The town of Cottonwood's not far, 15 miles or so. There's a boarding house there, decent folks run it." "I have no money," Nora said flatly. "They took everything." Another silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. When Hayes spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. "I've got a proposition for you, Miss Patterson. My ranch needs help. I lost my cook 2 months back when he decided mining for gold would be more profitable than flipping flapjacks for cowhands. I've been making do, but—" He shrugged. "None of us has much skill in the kitchen. If you can cook, there's a job waiting for you, room and board included." Nora looked up sharply, studying his face for any sign of deception. "You don't know me, Mr. Vaughn. I could be a terrible cook." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Are you?" Despite everything, Nora felt an answering smile tug at her lips. "No, my mother made sure of that before she passed. Then we have the beginnings of an arrangement." Hayes leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I run a respectable outfit, Miss Patterson. You'd have your own quarters small, but private. The men know to mind their manners or answer to me. If at any point you want to leave, I'll personally see you safely to wherever you want to go." Nora considered his offer, weighing her limited options. Stay here and likely perish from exposure or starvation. Try to walk to town with no supplies and no guarantee of finding work when she arrived, or accept this stranger's offer of employment. "Why would you help me?" she asked finally. Hayes looked into the fire, his expression thoughtful. "Out here, folks have to look out for each other. It's the only way to survive." He met her gaze again. "Besides, I lost my own pa when I was young. Know what it's like to feel the ground disappear beneath your feet." Something in his words, in the quiet sincerity of them, made her decision for her. "I accept your offer, Mr. Vaughn," Nora said, straightening her shoulders despite her exhaustion. "But I want to be clear, I'm accepting a job, not charity." Hayes nodded, respect evident in his eyes. "Understood, Miss Patterson. We'll head out at first light if that suits you." "It does." Nora glanced back at the ruins of her home. "There's nothing left for me here." As the night deepened around them, Hayes kept the fire burning and insisted Nora use his bedroll while he kept watch. Curled in the relative comfort of the blankets that smelled of pine and horses and something indefinably male, Nora felt the first stirrings of hope since the raiders had destroyed her world. Tomorrow she would leave these ashes behind. Tomorrow, perhaps, she would begin to live again. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. Nora woke stiff and disoriented, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar bedroll before the events of the previous days came rushing back. She sat up quickly, scanning her surroundings. Hayes was already awake, tending to a small fire where a pot of coffee was beginning to boil. He glanced up as she stirred. "Morning," he said simply. "Coffee's almost ready." Nora ran a hand through her tangled hair, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. She hadn't bathed in days, and her dress was stained with ash and dirt. "Thank you," she managed, her voice rough with sleep. Hayes poured coffee into a tin cup and brought it to her, along with the last of yesterday's bread. "Not much of a breakfast, I'm afraid, but we'll get you a proper meal when we reach the ranch." Nora accepted the coffee gratefully, letting the warmth seep into her cold hands. "Your kindness is already more than I expected to find out here." A shadow crossed Hayes's face. "The West isn't all lawlessness, despite what happened to you and your father. There are good people trying to build something worthwhile." "And you're one of them?" Nora asked, studying him over the rim of her cup. "I try to be," he replied, his tone matter of fact rather than boastful. "My ranch isn't much compared to some, but it's honest work." As they finished their sparse breakfast, Nora insisted on helping pack up the camp. There wasn't much, just Hayes's bedroll and cooking utensils, but the activity felt good after days of helpless grief. "Is there anything you want to take with you?" Hayes asked gently, gesturing toward the burned cabin. "Anything that might have survived?" Nora looked at the blackened timbers that had once been her home. "I should check," she said reluctantly. "There might be something." Together they picked through the ruins, Hayes keeping a respectful distance as Nora sifted through ash and charred debris. Most everything was destroyed beyond recognition, but in what had been her father's room, she found a small metal box, its contents somewhat protected from the worst of the fire. Inside was her mother's cameo brooch, slightly tarnished but intact, and her father's pocket watch, the glass cracked but the mechanism still ticking faintly when she wound it. Tears stung her eyes as she clutched these small treasures to her chest. "Found something worth saving?" Hayes asked softly from behind her. Nora nodded, unable to speak. She slipped the items into her pocket, taking a deep breath to compose herself. "That's all then," she said, turning away from the ruins. "I'm ready to go." Hayes helped her mount his palomino, then swung up behind her. The solid warmth of him at her back was both reassuring and disconcerting. It had been years since Nora had been this close to a man who wasn't her father, and despite her grief and the practicality of their arrangement, she couldn't help but be aware of Hayes's strong arms on either side of her as he took up the reins. They rode west across rolling grassland, the morning sun at their backs. Hayes was a quiet man, not given to unnecessary conversation, but the silence between them was companionable rather than strained. Occasionally, he would point out landmarks or name the wildflowers that dotted the prairie, his deep voice rumbling against her back. "How long have you had your ranch?" Nora asked after they'd been riding for about an hour. "Going on 5 years now," Hayes replied. "Started with just 20 acres and a dozen head of cattle. Been building it up slow but steady. You came west on your own, had a partner at first, old friend from back east, but Thaddeus wasn't cut out for ranch life. Too much work, too little reward in the early days. He headed to California after the first winter." Nora thought about that. "And you stayed." "Land gets in your blood," Hayes said simply. "Once you've worked it, shaped it, suffered for it, it becomes part of you." His words resonated with Nora, reminding her of her father's passion for their small homestead. "That's what my father used to say. He loved our little plot of land, modest as it was. What brought you two out here?" Nora hesitated, but found she wanted to talk about her father, to make someone else understand what had been lost. "After my mother died, there was nothing keeping us in Philadelphia. Pa had always dreamed of raising cattle in the West, said the city was slowly suffocating him." She smiled sadly at the memory. He'd read about the Homestead Act in the newspaper and couldn't stop talking about it. One day he asked if I'd come with him or if I'd rather stay with my aunt in Boston. "And you chose to follow him west," Hayes observed. "I did. My aunt's house was stifling in its own way. All those rules about proper behavior, proper dress, the constant pressure to find a suitable husband." Nora shook her head. "The idea of the West, of open spaces and new beginnings, appealed to me too." "Was it what you expected?" Nora considered the question. "Yes and no. It was harder than I imagined. The work never ends and the isolation can be wearing. But there's a freedom here I never found in the city, at least there was." Hayes didn't press when her voice trailed off. Instead, he pointed to a ridge in the distance. "That's Cottonwood Creek. My ranch lies just beyond it." As they crested the ridge an hour later, Nora got her first glimpse of Hayes Vaughn's ranch. It was larger than she'd expected, a sturdy main house built of logs and stone, a large barn, corrals, and several outbuildings spread across a verdant valley bisected by a creek. Cattle grazed on the surrounding grasslands, and a small garden plot was visible near the house. "It's beautiful," Nora said honestly. Hayes seemed pleased by her reaction. "Like I said, it's not the biggest spread, but it's good land. Creek never runs dry, even in summer." As they approached, 2 men emerged from the barn, watching their arrival with obvious curiosity. Hayes raised a hand in greeting as they rode into the yard. "Found a stray," called the older of the two, a weathered man with a salt and pepper beard. "Found our new cook," Hayes corrected, dismounting before reaching up to help Nora down. His hands were strong and sure at her waist, lifting her easily. "Miss Nora Patterson," he said, making the introductions. This is Frank Miller, my foreman, and Lucas Reed, one of our hands." Frank tipped his hat politely, though his eyes were questioning. Lucas, a lanky young man who couldn't have been much older than Nora herself, simply stared, apparently taken aback by the unexpected arrival of a woman. "Miss Patterson's cabin was raided," Hayes explained, his tone making it clear he wouldn't tolerate any improper questions. "She's agreed to take over kitchen duties in exchange for room and board." Frank's expression softened with understanding. "Sorry to hear about your trouble, miss. We're glad to have you all the same. Hayes here burns water and the rest of us ain't much better." Nora managed a small smile. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. Frank'll do just fine," the foreman said kindly. Hayes took the reins of his horse, handing them to Lucas. "Cool him down and see he gets extra grain," he instructed before turning to Nora. "Let me show you the house and where you'll be staying." The main house was simply but solidly built, with a large common room that served as both dining area and gathering space for the men. The kitchen was attached to the rear, a spacious room with a good-sized hearth, a cast-iron stove, and ample workspace. It was clean but disorganized, showing the evidence of bachelor living. "The pantry's through there," Hayes said, indicating a door at the back of the kitchen. "Should be reasonably well stocked. We get supplies from town once a month." Nora nodded, already mentally cataloging what she would need to bring order to the chaos. "Your quarters are this way," Hayes continued, leading her through another door and down a short hallway. The room he showed her was small but private, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a basin for washing. A window overlooked the creek, letting in afternoon light. "It's not much," Hayes said, watching her reaction. "It's perfect," Nora replied honestly. After sleeping on the cold ground beside the ashes of her home, this modest room seemed like luxury. Hayes looked relieved. "There's a small bathhouse behind the kitchen. I'll have the boys heat water for you if you'd like to clean up. And I'm sure we can find you some fresh clothes until we can get to town." The thought of a bath nearly brought Nora to tears. "That would be wonderful, thank you." "I'll leave you to get settled then," Hayes said, backing toward the door. "Rest if you need to." "No one expects you to start work today," but Nora shook her head. "I'd rather keep busy if it's all the same to you. Cooking dinner will help me learn my way around the kitchen." Hayes studied her for a moment, something like admiration in his eyes. "As you wish, Miss Patterson." "Dinner's usually around sundown. There's 4 of us altogether. Frank and Lucas you've met, and Ellie Santos should be back from checking the north pasture by then." After he left, Nora sank onto the bed, finally allowing herself a moment of quiet reflection. Yesterday she had been alone in the world, homeless and hopeless. Today she had a roof over her head, a purpose, and the beginnings of safety. It wasn't the life she had envisioned when she'd come west with her father, but it was a chance to survive, to rebuild. For now, that would have to be enough. The bath was everything Nora had hoped for, hot water that sluiced away days of grime and grief, if only temporarily. One of the ranch hands had left a bundle of clothing outside her door while she bathed men's shirts and trousers that would be too large, but clean at least, and a belt to cinch the waist. There was also, unexpectedly, a dress, faded blue calico, simple in design but apparently new or nearly so. A note in a careful hand accompanied it. "Miss Patterson thought you might prefer this to men's clothing. It belonged to my sister when she visited last year. She left it behind and won't miss it." Hayes Vaughn. Nora held the dress against herself, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. It would be a bit loose, but not unmanageably so. She dressed quickly, eager to begin establishing her new role in the household. The kitchen, upon closer inspection, was better equipped than she had initially thought. The previous cook had left behind an impressive array of cast-iron cookware, and the pantry was indeed well stocked with basics: flour, sugar, coffee, beans, and preserved goods. There was even a small herb garden visible through the kitchen window, though it looked somewhat neglected. Nora rolled up her sleeves and set to work. By the time the men began filtering in for the evening meal, she had produced a hearty beef stew, fresh biscuits, and a simple apple cobbler made from dried apples reconstituted in water and sweetened with the last of the summer's honey. The appreciative looks on the cowboys' faces as they entered the kitchen and caught the aroma of home cooking made Nora's efforts worthwhile. Ellie Santos, the 4th member of the ranch's small crew, was a compact Mexican man with a ready smile and quick wit. He greeted Nora with old-world courtesy that put her immediately at ease. "Miss Patterson, you are an angel sent from heaven," he declared after his first bite of stew. "We have been surviving on burned beans and tough jerky for too long." The men ate with the hearty appetite of those who worked hard outdoors, and Nora found herself relaxing as the meal progressed. Their conversation was edited for her presence, she was sure, but it was good-natured and inclusive, touching on the day's work, the condition of the herd, and local news. Hayes spoke little, but she often felt his eyes on her, gauging her comfort level with her new surroundings. When he did contribute to the conversation, the others listened with respect. It was clear he was not just their employer, but someone they genuinely admired. As the men finished eating, Frank leaned back in his chair with a contented sigh. "Miss Patterson, that was the finest meal I've had since leaving my mother's table in Tennessee 15 years ago." Nora smiled, pleased by the compliment. "Thank you, Frank. I'm glad you enjoyed it." "If you cook like this every day, we'll all be too fat to ride by winter," Lucas added with a grin. "You could use some fattening up, young man," Nora replied, falling easily into the maternal role that seemed expected of her as the only woman in a household of men. "You're all skin and bones." This earned a round of laughter from the others and a mock, wounded look from Lucas. As the evening wound down, the men drifted off to their bunks in the separate bunkhouse, leaving Nora and Hayes alone in the kitchen. She began clearing the dishes, but Hayes stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Leave those for now," he said. "You've done more than enough for your first day here." Nora hesitated, then nodded, suddenly aware of how tired she was. The events of the past few days were catching up to her. Hayes seemed to notice her fatigue. "Would you like to sit outside for a spell? The evenings are pleasant this time of year." The invitation was unexpected but welcome. Nora followed him onto the porch, where they settled into two rocking chairs facing the darkening landscape. The first stars were appearing in the eastern sky, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and grass. "Your men seem like good people," Nora observed after a comfortable silence. Hayes nodded. "They are. Frank's been with me since the beginning, couldn't have built this place without him. He joined up 2 years ago when he decided mining wasn't for him. Lucas is the newest, just a kid really, but he's a hard worker and eager to learn." "They respect you," Nora said. "It wasn't a question. Respect goes both ways out here. A man who doesn't value his hands won't keep them long." Hayes rocked slowly, his gaze on the distant horizon. "What about you, Miss Patterson? How are you finding your first day at the Flying V?" "Flying V?" Hayes looked slightly embarrassed. "That's what we call the place. Every ranch needs a name, I suppose." "I like it," Nora said, smiling faintly. "And to answer your question, I'm grateful for the work, the room, all of it." "You've earned your keep already with that meal," Hayes assured her, "but I hope in time you'll come to see this as more than just employment. I'd like you to feel at home here as much as possible under the circumstances." The kindness in his voice made Nora's throat tighten unexpectedly. "That might take some time," she admitted. "Of course," Hayes said quickly. "I didn't mean to presume. What happened to you and your father?" "Well, some wounds don't heal quickly. Or ever," Nora whispered, voicing the fear that had been lurking in her heart. Hayes was quiet for a long moment. "My father was killed when I was 16, he said finally. "Shot in the street by a man he'd never met, over an imagined insult in a saloon. I watched it happen." Nora turned to look at him, surprised by this personal revelation. "I wanted to die myself after," Hayes continued, his voice low and even. "Thought the pain would swallow me whole, but it didn't. Life insisted on continuing, and eventually I found reasons to continue with it." "What reasons?" Nora asked, genuinely curious. Hayes gestured to the ranch around them. "This, for one, the chance to build something lasting, to work honest land under an honest sky." He paused. "I'm not saying your grief will follow the same path as mine, only that I understand something of what you're feeling, and that you don't have to face it alone." Nora felt the first tear slip down her cheek before she realized she was crying. She brushed it away quickly, embarrassed by this display of weakness. "I'm sorry," she began, but Hayes shook his head. "Don't apologize for grieving, Miss Patterson, not to me." They sat in silence after that, watching as more stars appeared in the deepening darkness. Nora felt something shift inside her, not healing, exactly, but perhaps the first acknowledgement that healing might someday be possible. When she finally rose to go to her room, exhaustion making her steps unsteady, Hayes stood as well. "Thank you for sharing your story," Nora said softly. "And for the dress, it was very thoughtful." Hayes ducked his head slightly as if uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Rest well, Miss Patterson, tomorrow is a new day." As Nora lay in her narrow bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her, she thought about Hayes Vaughn and the unexpected kindness he had shown to a stranger. There was a steadiness to him that reminded her of her father, yet something else entirely that was uniquely his own. For the first time since the raiders had destroyed her world, Nora fell asleep without tears, the weight of grief momentarily lightened by the promise of tomorrow. Days at the Flying V quickly settled into a rhythm that Nora found both comforting and healing. She rose before dawn to start breakfast for the men, who headed out to work as the sun crested the eastern hills. Mornings were spent baking bread, tending to the neglected herb garden, and preparing the midday meal. Afternoons offered a few hours of relative solitude, which she used to mend clothing, clean the common areas of the house, or occasionally walk along the creek that gave the ranch much of its value. The cowboys returned at dusk, hungry and tired from their day's labor. Dinner was the social center of ranch life, a time for stories, laughter, and the sharing of news. Nora found herself looking forward to these gatherings, to the easy camaraderie of the men and their obvious appreciation of her cooking. Hayes was often the last to come in from the fields, his responsibilities keeping him out later than the others. But he never missed a meal, and though he wasn't as talkative as Frank or as jovial as Ali, his presence anchored the household in a way Nora came to depend upon. 2 weeks after her arrival, Nora was kneading dough for the next day's bread when Hayes appeared in the kitchen doorway. It was mid-afternoon, an unusual time for him to be at the house. "Miss Patterson," he said, hat in hand, "I'm riding into town for supplies. Thought you might want to come along, see if there's anything you need." Nora brushed flour from her hands, surprised by the invitation. "I would like that, yes. The pantry is running low on sugar and coffee." "And I imagine you might want some things for yourself," Hayes added. "Proper clothes, for one. You can't keep wearing that same dress forever." Nora glanced down at the blue calico, which she'd been washing carefully every few days. "I don't have any money, Mr. Vaughn, not yet." "Consider it an advance on your wages," Hayes said promptly. "We agreed on room, board, and fair compensation. It's time I made good on the last part." Nora hesitated, her pride warring with practicality. "Very well," she said finally. "When would you like to leave?" "As soon as you're ready. It's about an hour's ride to Cottonwood, and I'd like to be back before dark." Nora quickly covered the bread dough and washed her hands. She had nothing to change into, but she smoothed her hair and pinned it more neatly before joining Hayes in the yard, where he waited with 2 saddled horses. "This is Daisy," he said, indicating a gentle-looking bay mare. "She's steady and sweet-tempered." Nora approached the horse cautiously. "I haven't ridden much," she admitted. "We had a wagon back home." "Daisy will take care of you," Hayes assured her, helping her mount. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary, and Nora felt a strange flutter in her stomach at the contact. The ride to town was pleasant, with Hayes pointing out local landmarks and sharing stories of the area's early settlement. Nora found herself laughing at his tale of the town's founder, who had supposedly named Cottonwood after getting lost in a grove of the trees for 3 days, convinced he was wandering in circles. "Is that true?" she asked, smiling. Hayes shrugged, eyes twinkling. "That's what they say, though old Silas Cottonwood tells it differently depending on how much whiskey he's had." Cottonwood itself proved to be a small but growing town, one Main Street, lined with false-fronted buildings, a church, a schoolhouse, and scattered residences. The usual businesses were present: a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, a small hotel, and a combination post office and barbershop. Hayes helped Nora dismount in front of the general store, tying their horses to the hitching post. "Mrs. Winters runs this place," he explained. "Good woman, fair prices. Her husband died in the war, left her with 3 kids to raise." The bell above the door jingled as they entered the store, announcing their arrival. A plump, pleasant-faced woman looked up from behind the counter, her face breaking into a smile when she saw Hayes. "Mr. Vaughn, been wondering when you'd make it to town again." Her curious gaze shifted to Nora, eyebrows rising slightly. "Mrs. Winters," Hayes said, touching the brim of his hat politely. "This is Miss Nora Patterson, my new cook. Miss Patterson, Mrs. Alina Winters." "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Winters," Nora said, extending her hand. The older woman's grip was firm and friendly. "Likewise, dear, we don't see many new faces in Cottonwood, especially not young ladies." She gave Hayes a pointed look that made him shift uncomfortably. "Miss Patterson needs some things," he said, clearing his throat. "Clothes and such, and we're low on supplies at the ranch." "Of course," Mrs. Winters said, turning her attention fully to Nora. "Come with me, dear. I have a selection of ready-made dresses, or fabric if you prefer to sew your own." While Hayes attended to the ranch supplies, Mrs. Winters guided Nora to a corner of the store where various goods for women were displayed. The selection wasn't extensive, but after weeks in the same dress, Nora found herself almost overwhelmed by the choices. "Now, tell me honestly," Mrs. Winters said in a lowered voice as they examined a bolt of calico, "are you really just Mr. Vaughn's cook?" "Because if you need help, I am," Nora assured her quickly, understanding the woman's concern. "Mr. Vaughn found me after raiders burned my father's homestead. He offered me employment when I had nowhere else to go." Mrs. Winters's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that, dear. There's been too much lawlessness in these parts lately." She patted Nora's hand. "Hayes Vaughn is a good man, one of the best in the territory. If you ask me, you could have found worse employment." "He's been very kind," Nora agreed, selecting a practical brown dress and a slightly prettier blue one with white piping. "Kind, yes, and handsome too, if a bit on the serious side," Mrs. Winters observed with a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Half the unmarried women in the county have set their caps for him, but he never seems to notice." Nora felt her cheeks warm. "I'm not. That is, our arrangement is purely professional." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Winters said, not sounding convinced. "Now, you'll need some underthings as well, and perhaps a shawl for the cooler evenings." By the time they finished, Nora had acquired a modest but adequate wardrobe, along with personal items she'd been sorely missing: a hairbrush, soap that smelled of lavender rather than lye, and even a small bottle of rose water. Hayes insisted on paying for it all, waving away her protests. "You can settle accounts with me once you've drawn a few months' wages," he said firmly. "For now, consider it part of the room and board arrangement." Their last stop was the post office, where Hayes inquired about mail. To Nora's surprise, the postmaster handed her a letter along with Hayes's correspondence. "For me?" she asked, confused. "Word travels fast in these parts," Hayes explained as they left the building. "Frank mentioned to the blacksmith about the raid on your place when he was in town last week. Must have gotten around that you're staying at the Flying V." Nora examined the envelope. It was addressed simply to Miss Nora Patterson, care of Hayes Vaughn, Flying V Ranch. The return address was from Cottonwood itself. "It's from the sheriff," she said, recognizing the name. Hayes's expression turned serious. "Open it." The letter was brief and to the point. Sheriff Thomas Garrett requested that Miss Patterson come to his office at her earliest convenience to discuss the raid on her property, as he was investigating similar incidents in the area. "We should go now," Hayes said after reading over her shoulder. "His office is just down the street." The sheriff's office was a small but tidy building at the end of the main street. Sheriff Garrett himself was a lean, weathered man with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He rose as they entered, offering Nora a chair. "Miss Patterson, thank you for coming. Mr. Vaughn." He nodded to Hayes, who remained standing, hat in hand. "I understand you witnessed a raid on your father's homestead about 2 weeks ago." Nora nodded, her throat suddenly tight. "Yes, they killed my father and burned our cabin." The sheriff's expression was sympathetic but professional. "I'm sorry for your loss, miss. We've had 3 similar incidents in the past month, isolated homesteads targeted by a group of men, always at night. You're the first eyewitness we've found." "I didn't see much," Nora admitted. "It was dark and I was hiding." "Anything you can tell me would help. How many men, any distinguishing features, accents?" Nora closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember details she'd been trying to forget. "There were 5 of them." The leader was tall with a scar across his cheek here. She traced a line from her right eye to her jawline. He spoke with a southern accent, I think. One of the others called him captain, but I don't know if that was his real rank or just a nickname. Sheriff Garrett was making notes. Good, this is good. Anything else? One of them had a distinctive horse, a black stallion with a white blaze and 2 white socks on the front legs, and the leader wore a Confederate officer's coat, though it was worn and dirty. Hayes and the sheriff exchanged a glance. Sounds like Jeb Hardin and his gang, the sheriff said grimly. Ex-Confederate guerrilla. He's been moving west, staying ahead of the law. Word is he doesn't accept that the war is over. You think he's behind all the raids? Hayes asked. Sheriff Garrett nodded. Fits his pattern. He targets homesteaders who came west after the war, especially Union veterans or Northerners. He looked at Nora. Was your father in the war, miss? Yes, Nora said softly. He served with the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry. He was proud of it, too proud to hide it, even out here. That would have made him a target for Hardin, the sheriff confirmed. The man's a fanatic, believes he's still fighting for the Confederate cause. Hayes's jaw tightened. What's being done to stop him? I've wired the territorial marshal. He's forming a posse, but these men know the country, move fast, and don't stay in one place long. Sheriff Garrett looked directly at Nora. Miss Patterson, would you be willing to testify against these men if they're caught? Nora felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach at the thought of facing her father's killers, but she nodded firmly. Yes, they need to answer for what they've done. Good girl, the sheriff said approvingly. In the meantime, stay at the Flying V. Hardin tends to avoid larger ranches with multiple hands. Too much risk for too little reward. As they left the sheriff's office, Nora felt shaken by the conversation, the memories it had dredged up still raw and painful. Hayes must have noticed because he guided her to a small cafe next to the hotel. Let me buy you some tea before we head back, he said gently. Give you a chance to catch your breath. The cafe was quiet at this hour with only an elderly couple seated by the window. Hayes ordered tea for Nora and coffee for himself, along with a plate of cookies that the proprietress assured them were freshly baked that morning. Are you all right? Hayes asked when they were alone. That couldn't have been easy, recalling all those details. Nora wrapped her hands around the warm teacup. It helps actually knowing who they are, why they targeted us. I kept wondering if it was random bad luck or if we'd somehow brought it on ourselves. You didn't, Hayes said firmly. Hardin and his kind are just using old hatreds as an excuse for theft and murder. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the warm beverages and sweet cookies providing simple but effective comfort. Nora found herself studying Hayes when he wasn't looking, the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair curled slightly where it met his collar, the capable hands that held his coffee cup with surprising gentleness. Mrs. Winters's words echoed in her mind. Kind, yes, and handsome too. Nora couldn't deny the truth of that assessment, though she quickly pushed the thought away. Her position at the Flying V was precarious enough without developing inappropriate feelings for her employer. Penny for your thoughts, Hayes asked, catching her gaze. Nora felt her cheeks warm. I was just thinking about what the sheriff said about staying at the ranch for safety. I hope I'm not putting you and your men at risk by being there. Hardin would be a fool to take on the Flying V, Hayes said confidently. Besides, you're one of us now. We look after our own. One of us. The simple phrase warmed Nora more than the tea. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like she belonged somewhere. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than their journey to town, both of them lost in their own thoughts. As they crested the final ridge, the Flying V spread out below them, golden in the late afternoon sun. Nora was struck by how beautiful it was and how, in just 2 short weeks, it had begun to feel like home. Thank you for today, she said as they approached the house. For the clothes and everything else. Hayes glanced at her, a smile softening his features. My pleasure, Miss Patterson, though I admit I had selfish motives as well. It's nice to have company on these trips to town. Their eyes held for a moment longer than usual, and Nora felt something shift between them, a recognition. Perhaps, that what had begun as charity on his part and necessity on hers was evolving into something more complex. As he helped her down from Daisy's back, his hands at her waist strong and sure, Nora allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she'd been avoiding. She was starting to care for Hayes Vaughn as more than just her benefactor. And unless she was greatly mistaken, he might be feeling something similar for her. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. That night, as Nora hung her new dresses in the small wardrobe in her room, she caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above the washbasin. For the first time since the raid, she looked like herself again, no longer a grief-stricken refugee but a young woman with a future ahead of her. A future that, against all odds, was beginning to look brighter than she could have imagined in those dark days by the ashes of her burned cabin. The autumn days grew shorter as September gave way to October, painting the Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and amber. Nora settled more deeply into life at the Flying V, her presence bringing subtle changes to the ranch house. Curtains appeared at the windows, made from fabric left over from her dressmaking. The common room, once spartanly functional, now boasted colorful quilts over the chairs and wildflowers in mason jars. Even the men seemed to take more care with their appearance and language, as if her feminine influence had reminded them of civilities long neglected. Hayes noticed these changes with quiet approval. More than once, Nora caught him looking around the house with an expression of pleased surprise, as if seeing his home through new eyes. "You've worked magic here," he said one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, a habit they'd fallen into when weather permitted. "The place hasn't felt this much like a home since." He trailed off and Nora tilted her head questioningly. "Since when?" Hayes seemed to debate whether to continue. "Since my sister stayed here last year," he said finally. "Emily visits occasionally from Denver where she lives with her husband. The one who left the dress," Nora remembered. "I'd like to thank her someday." "You'll have the chance at Christmas," Hayes said. "She and her husband always spend the holiday here." He hesitated, then added, "I hope you'll still be with us then." The implication that she might leave caught Nora by surprise. "Where else would I go?" Hayes shrugged, his gaze on the distant hills. "I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to move on eventually. Cottonwoods growing there might be opportunities there, or Denver even. A young woman with your skills could find work in a larger town, maybe even open a boarding house of your own someday." Nora studied him, trying to read behind his casual words. Are you suggesting I should leave?" "No," Hayes said quickly, turning to face her. "Not at all, He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "I don't want you to feel obligated to stay if you have greater ambitions. The Flying V isn't much compared to city life." "I grew up in a city," Nora reminded him gently. "I came west willingly, remember. I've never regretted that choice, even after everything that happened." Relief flickered in Hayes's eyes. "So you're content here with us?" "More than content," Nora assured him, surprised by how true the words were. "I feel purposeful here, needed." "You are," Hayes said, his voice deeper than usual. "Needed, I mean, by all of us." Something in his tone made Nora wonder if he was speaking of more than just her cooking skills. But before she could pursue the thought, the moment was interrupted by the arrival of Frank, returning from a late check of the herd. "Evening, boss, Miss Patterson," the foreman said, removing his hat as he approached the porch. "Beautiful night." "It is," Hayes agreed, leaning back in his chair, the intimate mood broken. "How are the cattle looking?" As the men discussed ranch business, Nora's thoughts drifted to Hayes's concern that she might want to leave. The idea hadn't occurred to her. Somehow, in the weeks since he'd found her by the ashes of her cabin, the Flying V had become her home in ways her father's homestead never quite had. Here she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. And if she was honest with herself, much of that had to do with Hayes himself. His quiet strength, his integrity, the way he treated her with respect while still being protective, these qualities had slowly but surely worked their way into her heart. Nora wasn't naive. She knew her feelings were dangerous, potentially ruinous to the safe haven she'd found. Hayes was her employer, and while he'd been kind, even friendly, she had no real reason to believe he saw her as anything more than his cook and housekeeper. Yet sometimes, like tonight, she caught glimpses of something in his eyes when he looked at her, something that made her wonder if perhaps her growing affection wasn't entirely one-sided. The next morning brought the first frost of the season, silvering the grass and painting delicate patterns on the cabin windows. Nora rose early as usual, building up the kitchen fire and starting the coffee before beginning work on breakfast. The men would be especially hungry on a cold morning like this. She was rolling out biscuit dough when Hayes entered the kitchen, earlier than his usual time. He'd already been outside. His cheeks were ruddy from the cold, and he carried the scent of frost and pine with him. "Morning," he said, pouring himself coffee. "Looks like winter's making an early appearance." "So I see," Nora replied, glancing at the frosted window. "Will it affect the cattle?" Hayes shook his head. "Not yet, but it's a reminder that we need to prepare. I'm sending Ellie and Lucas to the South Range today to bring in the last of the herd from the summer pastures." He leaned against the counter, watching as she worked the dough. There was something comfortable about his presence, a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. "You're good at that," he observed. "Baking, I mean." Nora smiled, pleased by the simple compliment. "My mother taught me. She believed every woman should know how to make bread, even if she never had to." "Smart woman," Hayes said. "Your father was lucky to have her." "They were lucky to have each other," Nora corrected gently. "It nearly destroyed him when she died. If not for me, I think he might have given up entirely." Hayes was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee. "Is that why you came west with him, to keep him going?" Nora considered the question as she cut the biscuit dough into rounds. "Partly, but also because I couldn't bear to be separated from him. He was all I had left." She placed the biscuits on a tray ready for the oven. "What about your family? You mentioned your sister, but what about your mother?" "She remarried after my father was killed," Hayes said, his tone neutral. "Good man, owned a hardware store in St. Louis. They're still there. We write occasionally, but we were never close after she remarried. Too many painful memories, I guess. And that's why you came west." "To escape those memories," Hayes shrugged. "That, and I never had the temperament for city living or indoor work. Always wanted land of my own, something I could build with my hands." He drained his coffee cup. "Got lucky when I won some money in a poker game in Denver. Used it for the down payment on this place." "You won the Flying V in a poker game?" Nora asked, surprised. A smile touched Hayes' lips. "Not exactly. Won enough to buy it legitimately, probably the only honest thing that ever came out of gambling." Nora laughed, sliding the biscuits into the oven. "Well, I'm glad you did. Otherwise, where would I be?" The question, meant lightly, cast a sudden shadow between them. Where indeed would she be if Hayes hadn't found her by the ashes of her cabin? "Nora," Hayes said, using her given name for the first time, "I've been meaning to ask you something." The seriousness in his tone made her heart quicken. "Yes." Before he could continue, the kitchen door swung open and Frank burst in, his expression urgent. "Boss, riders coming." 6 of them moving fast. Hayes was instantly alert. "Raiders?" Frank shook his head. "Don't think so. One's wearing what looks like a U.S. Marshal's badge. Might be that posse the sheriff mentioned." Hayes nodded, his earlier conversation with Nora apparently forgotten. "Let's go meet them." "Nora, stay inside until we know what they want." Without waiting for her response, he grabbed his hat and followed Frank outside. Nora moved to the kitchen window, watching as Hayes and Frank walked out to meet the approaching riders. Sure enough, the lead man wore the distinctive star-shaped badge of a U.S. Marshal. The conversation was too distant for her to hear, but she saw Hayes nod and gesture toward the house. A moment later, he was heading back to the kitchen, the marshal following. "Miss Patterson," Hayes said as they entered. "This is Marshal James Cooper. He's tracking Jeb Hardin's gang and would like to speak with you." Marshal Cooper was a tall man with a neatly trimmed gray beard and the watchful eyes of someone who'd seen too much of human nature's darker side. He removed his hat as he entered, revealing thinning gray hair. "Miss Patterson," he said, nodding respectfully. "Sheriff Garrett told me you witnessed a raid by Hardin's gang. I'm hoping you can confirm some details that might help us track them down." "Of course," Nora said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Please sit down. Can I offer you coffee?" "Much obliged, miss." As she poured coffee for the Marshal, Hayes, and herself, Nora felt a flutter of anxiety. Describing the raid meant reliving it, something she'd been trying to avoid. "I understand this is difficult," Marshal Cooper said, as if reading her thoughts. "But anything you can tell me might help ensure these men can't hurt anyone else." Nora nodded, gathering her courage. "What do you need to know?" For the next half hour, she answered the Marshal's questions, describing in as much detail as she could remember the men who had attacked her home and killed her father. Hayes remained by her side throughout, his steady presence a comfort. "You've been very helpful, Miss Patterson," Marshal Cooper said finally. Based on your description and reports from other witnesses, we're confident we're dealing with Jeb Hardin's gang. They've been moving north, staying ahead of the law, but they're getting careless. Attacked a ranch near Medicine Bow 3 days ago, but the owner and his hands fought them off. One of Hardin's men was wounded. So you're close to catching them? Hayes asked. The marshal's expression was grim. We're gaining. Problem is, they know we're after them now. Makes them more dangerous. They might try one big score before fleeing the territory. What kind of score? Nora asked, a chill running through her. Bank maybe, or a large ranch that seems vulnerable. Marshal Cooper glanced at Hayes. You should be cautious, Mr. Vaughn. Increase your watches, especially at night. Hayes nodded, his jaw set. We will. After the marshal and his posse departed, continuing their pursuit of Hardin's gang, a tense atmosphere settled over the Flying V. Hayes called the men together, explaining the situation and establishing a watch rotation. Weapons were checked and cleaned, and extra ammunition was distributed. Do you really think they might come here? Nora asked Hayes that evening as they sat in the kitchen after the others had gone to their bunks. Frank was taking the first watch from the barn loft, which offered a good view of the surrounding countryside. Probably not, Hayes said, though his expression remained worried. We're not an obvious target, not wealthy enough to be worth the risk, but I won't take chances with the safety of my people. He looked at her directly. Especially you. Me, you're a witness who could identify them, Hayes reminded her. If Hardin knows that, it makes you a liability to him. The thought sent a shiver through Nora. I hadn't considered that. Hayes reached across the table, covering her hand with his. Nothing's going to happen to you, Nora, I promise you that. The touch of his hand and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. For a moment they sat like that, connected by more than just the physical contact. Hayes, she began, not sure what she wanted to say, but feeling the need to say something. I should check on Frank, he said abruptly, pulling his hand away and standing. Try to get some sleep. I'll be keeping watch most of the night. After he left, Nora remained at the table, her hand still warm where he had touched it. Something had changed between them today, some barrier had lowered, if only slightly. She wasn't sure if it was his use of her given name, the threat of danger bringing them closer, or simply the natural evolution of feelings that had been growing for weeks. Whatever it was, Nora knew that her future at the Flying V, the future Hayes had promised her when he found her by the ashes of her cabin, was becoming more complex and more precious with each passing day. The next few days passed in a state of heightened vigilance. Hayes doubled the watch rotations, and no one ventured far from the ranch buildings alone. Nora noticed that Hayes himself seemed to sleep little, often checking the property boundaries late into the night and rising before dawn. 5 days after the marshal's visit, Ellie returned from a supply run to Cottonwood with news. Hardin's gang had robbed the bank in a small settlement 30 miles east, killing the clerk in the process. The marshal's posse was in hot pursuit, but the gang had a head start. Sheriff thinks they'll head for the mountains, Ellie reported as they gathered in the kitchen. Try to lose the posse in the high country before winter sets in. Let's hope he's right, Hayes said grimly, but we'll maintain our watches until we know for sure they're gone from these parts. That night, an early winter storm blew in, bringing slashing rain that later turned to wet, heavy snow. By morning, 4 inches of white covered the ground, with more falling steadily. The sudden shift in weather meant all hands were needed to check on the cattle and ensure they had access to feed. The men and I will be out most of the day, Hayes told Nora over a hurried breakfast. Keep the doors locked and keep my rifle close. He nodded to the Winchester he'd placed near the kitchen door the day before. I will, Nora promised, trying to hide her unease at being left alone. Be careful out there, the weather looks treacherous. Hayes caught her gaze, holding it for a moment. You too. After the men rode out, Nora tried to occupy herself with her usual tasks, kneading bread, preparing stew for dinner, mending a tear in one of Lucas's shirts. But her nerves were stretched thin, every creak of the house in the wind making her jump. By mid-afternoon, the storm had intensified, howling around the eaves of the house like a living thing. Nora built up the fire in the kitchen stove, grateful for its warmth and light as the day grew prematurely dark. She was just placing the finished loaves of bread on the counter to cool when she heard the unmistakable sound of a horse approaching. Relief flooded through her. Hayes or one of the men returning early, no doubt. She moved to the window, peering out through the snow-streaked glass. The rider who emerged from the swirling white was not Hayes. Nor was it Frank, Illy, or Lucas. It was a stranger, his hat pulled low against the storm, his coat heavy with snow. As he dismounted, Nora caught sight of a second horse tethered to the first, this one bearing another rider who slumped in the saddle, apparently injured. For a moment, Nora hesitated, torn between caution and compassion. These men could be anyone, travelers caught in the storm, neighboring ranchers seeking shelter, or raiders. The injured man slid from his saddle into the snow, and his companion bent over him with evident concern. That decided her. Whatever else these men might be, one was hurt and needed help. Nora grabbed Hayes's rifle, holding it ready but not aiming it as she opened the door just enough to call out. "Who's there? State your business." The standing man looked up, snow plastering his beard and hat. "Madam, my brother's been shot. We got caught in the storm. Please, we need help." Nora hesitated, the rifle steady in her hands. "Who are you? Where are you from?" "Name's Tom Reeves. This is my brother Sam. We're from the Circle R north of here. Got separated from our hands in the storm after a run-in with rustlers." Sam took a bullet. The Circle R was a ranch Hayes had mentioned, not close, but known in the area. Still, Nora wasn't taking chances. "Stay where you are," she called. "I'll come out." Keeping the rifle ready, Nora stepped onto the porch. The cold immediately bit through her dress, but she ignored it, focusing on the men before her. The one called Tom had his hands raised slightly, showing he was unarmed. His brother lay in the snow, a dark stain visible on his coat even through the falling white. "We don't mean any harm, madam," Tom said, his voice desperate. "But Sam needs help bad. He's losing blood." Nora made her decision. "Bring him inside, but know that the men who work this ranch will be back soon, and I have this rifle if you try anything." Tom nodded quickly. "Yes, madam." "Thank you." Together they managed to get Sam into the house and laid out on the table in the common room. He was a young man, perhaps 25, with a face made pale by blood loss and pain. The wound was in his shoulder, the bullet having passed clean through. Nora set aside the rifle, though she kept it within reach, and began gathering what she needed to treat the wound. Her mother had taught her basic nursing skills, and living on the frontier had added to that knowledge. How long ago was he shot? She asked as she heated water and gathered clean cloths. "About 4 hours," Tom replied, hovering anxiously. "We were checking fence lines when we came across men driving cattle that weren't theirs. They opened fire before we could even speak." Nora cleaned the wound as best she could, applied a poultice of herbs she dried from her garden, and bandaged it tightly. Throughout the process, Sam drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally groaning but otherwise stoic. "He needs a doctor," Nora said when she'd finished. "But he should be stable enough to wait out the storm." Tom's relief was palpable. "Thank you, madam. I don't know what we would have done if we hadn't found your place." "You're welcome to food and shelter until the storm passes," Nora said, washing blood from her hands. "But I should warn you, the owner of this ranch is very protective. When he returns, he'll want to verify your story." "Understandable," Tom said easily. "Who's the owner? Maybe we know him." Hayes Vaughn, a flicker of something recognition, concern, crossed Tom's face before he nodded. "Heard the name, I think, though we haven't met." Nora moved to the stove to check on the stew, keeping both men in her peripheral vision. Something about Tom's reaction to Hayes's name had raised a flag of caution in her mind. "Your horses will need tending," she said. "There's a lean-to on the side of the barn where you can shelter them from the worst of the storm." "Much obliged," Tom said, moving toward the door. "I'll just see to them now." As soon as he left, Nora moved to Sam, who was watching her through half-lidded eyes. "Your brother seems concerned about meeting Hayes Vaughn," she said directly. "Is there something I should know?" Sam licked dry lips. "Not my brother," he whispered. Nora went still. "What? Tom's not my brother. Name's not even Tom." A cold knot formed in Nora's stomach. "Who is he then?" Sam's eyes darted to the door. "Captain Hardin's second in command, Scott Reeves." His voice was barely audible. "I'm just a new recruit. Got shot when a posse caught up to us yesterday. Captain left me behind, but Reeves came back." Nora's blood turned to ice. She was harboring members of Hardin's gang, the very men who had murdered her father and burned her home. And their leader might be nearby. "Is Hardin coming here?" she demanded, gripping Sam's uninjured shoulder. Pain flashed across his face. Don't know, Reeves said. Said we'd wait out the storm, then meet up with the others. But I heard them talking before, about a big ranch, good score before heading to the mountains. The door opened, and Nora straightened quickly, moving back to the stove as if she'd just been checking the food. Reeves stamped snow from his boots, bringing a gust of cold air with him. Horses are settled, he said, removing his coat. Storm's getting worse. Your men might not make it back tonight. They know this land, Nora replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. They'll be fine. Reeves hung his coat by the door, and Nora saw what she'd missed before a gun belt with 2 revolvers. He caught her looking and smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Insurance, he said lightly. Dangerous country. Nora nodded, mind racing. She needed to get to Hayes's rifle, which she'd left leaning against the wall near Sam. But Reeves was between her and the weapon. The stew smells mighty good, Reeves commented, moving further into the room. Been a while since we had a home-cooked meal. It'll be ready soon, Nora said, desperately trying to think of a way to warn Hayes and the others when they returned. Why don't you sit down? You must be tired after your ordeal. Reeves settled into a chair, but his posture remained alert, watchful. You alone here, madam? Seems unusual for a woman to be manning a ranch by herself. I'm the cook, Nora explained, ladling stew into a bowl to give her hands something to do. Mr. Vaughn and his men are checking on the cattle in the storm, all of them. Reeves's interest was too keen to be casual. How many men work this ranch? Nora hesitated, then deliberately exaggerated. 8, including Mr. Vaughn, all experienced hands, good with rifles. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Reeves's face. He'd clearly been hoping for a smaller, more vulnerable target. 8, you say? Must be quite an operation. It is, Nora agreed, setting the bowl of stew before him. Mr. Vaughn is very successful. As Reeves ate, Nora moved around the kitchen, ostensibly preparing more food but actually trying to position herself closer to the rifle. Sam was watching her, his eyes communicating a silent warning she couldn't quite interpret. This is good, Reeves said, gesturing to the stew with his spoon. You're quite the cook, miss. Patterson, Nora supplied before she could think better of it. Nora Patterson. Reeves's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. Patterson, he repeated slowly. From around these parts, Nora realized her mistake too late. If this man was truly part of Hardin's gang, he might know about the raid on her father's homestead. No, she said quickly. I'm from back east originally. Reeves set down his spoon, his expression suddenly calculating. Funny coincidence. We hit a place belonging to a Patterson about 2 weeks back. Old man and his daughter, as I recall. Girl got away. His hand moved to one of his revolvers. Wouldn't happen to be related, would you? Before Nora could respond, Sam spoke up from the table. It's her, Scott, the girl from the cabin. I recognize her now. Reeves stood slowly, his gun now drawn and pointed at Nora. Well, ain't this interesting? Captain Hardin will be mighty pleased when I bring him not just a fat rancher's cattle and cash, but the witness who could identify us to the law. Nora backed away, her heart pounding. The marshal already knows who you are. Killing me won't change that. Maybe not, Reeves conceded with a cold smile. But it'll sure be satisfying. Your pa was stubborn too. Wouldn't tell us where he kept his money, even with a gun to his head. Rage surged through Nora, momentarily overwhelming her fear. Because he was a man of principle, something you wouldn't understand, Reeves laughed. Principles don't keep you warm at night, girl. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me exactly when Vaughn and his men are due back, how many there really are, and where they keep their valuables. Then you're going to help me signal the rest of our gang, who are waiting just over that ridge to the east. I'll do no such thing, Nora said firmly, though inside she was trembling. Reeves cocked his revolver. I reckon you will, unless you want to join your pa right now. A movement caught Nora's eye. Sam, sliding his hand beneath his coat. Before she could wonder what he was doing, a shot rang out, deafening in the confined space of the kitchen. Reeves staggered, a look of shock on his face as he glanced down at the spreading red stain on his shirt. He turned to look at Sam, who was holding a small derringer, smoke still curling from its barrel. You, traitor, Reeves gasped, raising his own gun. Nora didn't hesitate. She lunged for Hayes's rifle, grabbing it and swinging it up in one fluid motion. Her father had taught her to shoot on their homestead, drilling into her the importance of being able to defend herself in this wild country. She fired once. the bullet taking Reeves in the chest. He crumpled to the floor, his unfired revolver clattering beside him. For a moment, the kitchen was silent except for the howling of the storm outside and the harsh sound of Nora's breathing. Then Sam groaned. The effort of raising and firing his hidden gun having reopened his wound, Nora moved to him quickly, checking the bandage. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why did you help me?" Sam's face was gray with pain. "Not all of us are like Hardin. Some of us just made bad choices," he coughed weakly. "I didn't know what they really were when I joined up, thought they were just cowboys down on their luck. How many more are there?" Nora asked urgently. "You said they're waiting over the ridge," Sam nodded slightly. "4, including Hardin. Reeves was supposed to signal them once he'd checked the place out. If no signal by nightfall, they'll come anyway." Nora glanced at the window. The storm was still raging, but daylight was fading fast. She had perhaps an hour before Hardin and the rest of his gang arrived, expecting to find an easy target. And Hayes and the others were still out in the storm, unaware of the danger.